The morning of February 16, 1943, began like so many others in New Guinea, thick with heat, rain, and the low growl of engines rising over the jungle. At Port Moresby, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses from the 64th Bomb Squadron lumbered down the coral runway, bound for Rabaul. Their orders were simple and suicidal. Hit the Japanese port, cripple the supply lines feeding the enemy's bases at Kavieng and Leh, and get back alive if luck allowed. They knew Rabaul's anti-aircraft guns would already be awake, their black puffs of flak blooming over Simpson Harbor like poisonous flowers. Among the crews, there was an unspoken rule. If you went down in that water, you stayed there. It was too far, too dangerous, and the sea was never kind. At 0830 hours, one of the B-17s, tail number 412432, took a direct hit to its number 2 engine. The propeller shattered, the wing caught fire, and the bomber began to lose altitude fast. The pilot, Captain Bill Thompson, tried to hold her steady, but at 5,000 feet, he knew it was over. "Prepare to ditch," he shouted. The fortress hit the sea off Kavieng in a thunder of foam and spray. Within minutes, it was gone, leaving only burning oil and 12 men fighting to stay alive in the open ocean. 200 miles to the south, in a humid tent near Dobodura, Lieutenant Nathan Green Gordon of the U.S. Navy's Patrol Squadron 34 leaned over a radio operator's shoulder as a faint SOS came through the static. "B-17 down north of Kavieng. Survivors in the water. Need help." The signal broke, then returned, barely a whisper. Gordon glanced at the map pinned to the wall. Kavieng was deep in enemy territory, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and patrol boats. "Nobody's getting in there," said Ensign Pat Tatum, his co-pilot. "Not in this weather." Outside, the sky was already darkening, the leading edge of a tropical squall rolling in from the Bismarck Sea. Gordon said nothing for a moment. He stared at the black line of the approaching storm, then at the photo of his wife pinned to the instrument board. "They're still out there," he said finally. "If we wait, they won't be." He turned to his crew. "We're going." Their aircraft, a PBY 5A Catalina, sat moored in the lagoon, a giant silver bird with wings stretching 104 feet, twin engines gleaming through rain. It was slow, underpowered, and built for endurance, not heroics. But it could land on water, and sometimes that was enough. The crew scrambled aboard, Gordon at the controls, Tatum beside him, Chief Petty Officer Ralph DeBlanc on the engines, and radio operator Thomas Rhodes in the belly compartment. 2 gunners, Andy Nowak and Bill King, manned the waist blisters. The Catalina rose off the lagoon at 0945 hours, its wingtips slicing through curtains of rain. The weather worsened fast. Sheets of water lashed the cockpit windows, turning the horizon into a blur of gray. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the endless churn of the sea below. The Catalina's engines groaned as they fought against headwinds that seemed to shove the aircraft backward. "We're not flying," Tatum muttered. "We're swimming in the air." Gordon's hand stayed steady on the yoke. He had flown patrols through monsoons before, but never into one this violent, and never with a mission like this. As they neared Kavieng, the clouds split just enough for a glimpse of land, dark jungle, pale beaches, and beyond them, the skeletal shapes of Japanese ships anchored in the harbor. Smoke rose from gun emplacements. Gordon knew that any attempt to land here would draw fire immediately. But he also knew that somewhere beyond those reefs, men were dying. At 11:20 hours, DeBlanc spotted something through the rain, an orange life raft tossing between waves, then another, then a body. Gordon banked hard, circling low. He could see movement, hands waving weakly. Survivors, 11 of them. "They're alive," Rhodes shouted from the blister. "God, they're still alive." The sea was chaos, white caps slamming like walls, swells cresting over 3 meters high. Landing a Catalina in those conditions was nearly suicidal. Even in calm water, the impact could tear off the plane's wing floats or crack its hull. In this storm, it could break apart entirely. Tatum shook his head. "We can't land, Skipper. Not here. Not now." Gordon's jaw tightened. "They'll drown if we don't. And if we do, then we drown with them." He leveled the wings, lined up into the wind, and began his descent. Strap in. The Catalina roared downward through the rain. Spray exploded across the nose as the hull struck the first wave. The entire aircraft jolted as if hitting concrete, bounced skyward, then slammed down again. The second impact nearly wrenched the controls from Gordon's hands. A seam split along the forward hatch, flooding the bilge, but somehow the plane stayed upright, rocking violently on the crests. "She's holding," DeBlanc shouted. Gordon didn't answer. He was already out of his seat, wading through ankle-deep water to open the side hatch. Outside, the sea screamed against the metal skin. Through the spray, he saw the first survivor clinging to a raft. The man's face was blistered with salt burns, his eyes wide with disbelief. A rope was thrown, arms pulled, hands grabbed. One by one, the airmen were dragged aboard, half-conscious, bleeding, and soaked. Each rescue took minutes that felt like hours. From the north, tracer rounds began stitching across the water. Japanese gunners from Kavieng had spotted them. "We've got company," Nowak yelled, swinging his .50 caliber toward the shoreline. But the sea made aiming impossible. Every shot vanished into the storm. Inside, Gordon counted heads. 9 survivors so far. "That's all we can take," Tatum shouted over the noise. Gordon looked out through the rain. Farther out, another raft drifted between the swells. More men. He turned to his crew. "We're not leaving them." The radio crackled. "Nathan, if we stay any longer, we're not getting off this water." Gordon climbed back into the cockpit, eyes fixed on the horizon where waves rose like mountains. "Then we'll find a way," he said. "We always do." Outside, the storm roared louder, as if daring him to try. The sea wasn't done with them yet, and neither, it seemed, was Gordon done with the sea.
The Catalina rocked violently on the open ocean, its silver fuselage shuddering as waves crashed against the hull. Salt spray blew through the open hatch, stinging the faces of the crew as they hauled one soaked, trembling airman after another aboard. Lieutenant Nathan Gordon barely noticed the noise anymore. The roar of the wind had become a steady wall of sound in his skull. Every motion was deliberate, methodical, survival reduced to repetition. Pull, grab, lift, drag. The sea fought them for every body. Inside the cramped interior, the rescued B-17 men lay sprawled on the deck, pale and bleeding. One clutched a broken arm splunted crudely with a seat frame. Another's face was caked in oil, his flight suit shredded by shrapnel. Chief Petty Officer Ralph DeBlanc, the engineer, moved from man to man, checking pulses and tightening bandages torn from his own undershirt. "That's 9, shouted Ensign Pat Tatum, glancing back from the cockpit. 9 souls. We're overweight already." Gordon didn't look up. "There are more." He climbed into the pilot's seat and scanned the horizon through rain-smeared glass. The sea was alive, rolling, heaving, merciless. Between the troughs of water, he could see flashes of orange, another life raft half submerged, drifting away from them. "There," he said, pointing. 11 o'clock. "We can't maneuver in this," Tatum protested. "She'll broach if we turn broadside." "Then we don't turn," Gordon said calmly. He shoved the throttle forward. The Catalina's twin engines roared, straining against the weight of the storm. The flying boat crawled over the swells, engines coughing as spray filled the intakes. The motion felt wrong, a lumbering beast dragging itself through a graveyard of waves. Every few seconds, the hull slammed down with a gut-punch thud that shook bolts loose from the panels. "Easy, easy," Tatum muttered, gripping the controls. They reached the second raft 10 minutes later. The waves had scattered the survivors far apart. Each minute they drifted farther into the storm. One of the men in the raft was waving frantically, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Help! For God's sake, help us!" Gordon's voice stayed steady. "Rope ready." The crew heaved the line out, missing twice before it finally caught. 2 of the B-17 crew tried to climb the rope, but their hands were numb, slick with oil and salt.
Without hesitation, Gordon unbuckled his harness and crawled forward onto the bow, clutching the handrail as spray blasted him in the face. "Hold her steady," he yelled to Tatum. The next wave lifted the Catalina like a toy, then slammed it down. Gordon grabbed the first man by his flight vest and hauled him up by sheer force. The second man lost his grip and disappeared beneath the surface. Gordon dove an arm into the water, felt fabric, and pulled. For a long, impossible moment, the sea refused to let go. Then the man came free, gasping like a newborn. They collapsed together on the slick metal, panting. Gordon turned his head toward the cockpit. That makes 11. From the shoreline came another flash, tracer fire again, thin and red against the gray sky. The Japanese gunners at Kevyang had adjusted their aim. Shells burst in the water less than 100 yards away, each impact throwing fountains of white spray around the Catalina. "They've got us bracketed!" shouted Bill King, the starboard gunner. "Ignore it," Gordon said. "We're not staying." Inside, the aircraft groaned under the new weight. The bilge pumps struggled against the water seeping through the hull seams. DeBlock shouted over the noise. "We're taking on too much, Skipper. She won't lift off like this." "We're not leaving anyone behind," Gordon's voice was quiet but final. Out beyond the reef, two more orange shapes bobbed in the distance, the last of the B-17 crew. They were nearly 2 miles away, beyond the protective line of coral that was breaking the worst of the surf. To reach them, Gordon would have to taxi through the open sea, where the swells towered higher than the Catalina's wings. "It's suicide," Tatum said flatly. Gordon didn't argue. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines bellowed, straining against the waves. The Catalina climbed each wall of water, crashed down into the next, the hull shuddering so hard it seemed ready to split apart. Inside, the rescued airmen prayed, or vomited, or clung to whatever they could find. Then through the gray mist, Gordon saw them, 2 men clinging to an upside-down raft, one barely conscious. "Get the ladder ready!" he shouted. The Catalina crawled forward, slewing sideways in the surf. "Skipper, if we stay broadside." "We won't." Timing the roll of the waves, Gordon turned the yoke hard left at the exact moment the next swell lifted the starboard wing. The Catalina spun in place, aligning perfectly with the wind, a move that should have been impossible in seas this rough. The tail swung clear, the nose pointed into the storm. "Now!" he yelled. The crew tossed lines, pulled, strained, and dragged the final 2 survivors aboard. 15 men in total. 15 lives crammed into a plane designed to carry 9. The Catalina wallowed low in the water, its nose barely above the surface. Every gust of wind threatened to swamp it. "We can't take off like this," Tatum said, shaking his head. "We're dead weight." Gordon wiped salt water from his face. "Then we make her lighter." The crew went to work. Guns were unbolted and thrown overboard. Ammunition, radios, seats, anything not essential to flight was ripped out and dumped into the sea. Even the emergency rations went. The Catalina rose a few inches higher. It wasn't enough. Gordon studied the waves, calculating distances in his head. The ocean around Kevyang was a trap. Reefs to the north, enemy guns to the east, open water beyond the storm. They maybe had 1,000 feet of relatively calm swell before the reef line. To get airborne, they'd need more than double that. Tatum looked at him. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Gordon didn't answer. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines howled, straining against the waves. The Catalina climbed each wall of water, crashed down into the next, the hull shuddering so hard it seemed ready to split apart. Inside, the rescued airmen prayed, or vomited, or clung to whatever they could find. Then through the gray mist, Gordon saw them, 2 men clinging to an upside-down raft, one barely conscious. "Get the ladder ready!" he shouted. The Catalina crawled forward, slewing sideways in the surf. "Skipper, if we stay broadside." "We won't." Timing the roll of the waves, Gordon turned the yoke hard left at the exact moment the next swell lifted the starboard wing. The Catalina spun in place, aligning perfectly with the wind, a move that should have been impossible in seas this rough. The tail swung clear, the nose pointed into the storm. "Now!" he yelled. The crew tossed lines, pulled, strained, and dragged the final 2 survivors aboard. 15 men in total. 15 lives crammed into a plane designed to carry 9. The Catalina wallowed low in the water, its nose barely above the surface. Every gust of wind threatened to swamp it. "We can't take off like this," Tatum said, shaking his head. "We're dead weight." Gordon wiped salt water from his face. "Then we make her lighter." The crew went to work. Guns were unbolted and thrown overboard. Ammunition, radios, seats, anything not essential to flight was ripped out and dumped into the sea. Even the emergency rations went. The Catalina rose a few inches higher. It wasn't enough. Gordon studied the waves, calculating distances in his head. The ocean around Kevyang was a trap. Reefs to the north, enemy guns to the east, open water beyond the storm. They maybe had 1,000 feet of relatively calm swell before the reef line. To get airborne, they'd need more than double that. Tatum looked at him. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Gordon didn't answer. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines screamed. The Catalina shuddered, struggling to break free from the water. Waves slapped against the hull, dragging it back each time. "Come on, you bastard," Gordon whispered. The engines howled. Spray rose in twin curtains from the wingtips. The nose lifted, an inch, then a foot. The hull slammed down again, and the whole plane lurched. "Too heavy," DeBlanc shouted. "We'll never clear the reef." Gordon grit his teeth. "We don't need to clear it. We just need to ride it." He angled the plane toward a rising swell, one last desperate gamble. As the wave lifted them, he pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. The Catalina rode the crest, surged forward, and for a single impossible moment, the drag vanished. The sea fell away beneath them. The wings bit into the air. "We're flying," Tatum cried. Not yet. The altimeter crept past 50 feet, then 100. Another burst of flak erupted behind them, harmless now. The Catalina climbed into the clouds, carrying 15 souls out of hell. Behind them, the storm raged on, swallowing the sea that had nearly claimed them all. For now at least, the ocean had lost. For a few long, shuddering seconds after leaving the waves, the Catalina seemed unsure whether it wanted to be a plane or a ship. The engines screamed at full power, straining against their mounts, the wings flexing under the brutal weight of waterlogged fuselage and human cargo. Lieutenant Nathan Gordon could feel every vibration through the control column, a deep, mechanical tremor that ran straight into his bones. Behind him, 15 men were packed shoulder to shoulder, soaked, bleeding, barely conscious. The smell of fuel, salt, and sweat mixed into something sharp and raw. They had done the impossible, lifted off from a storm-torn sea under enemy guns, but they weren't safe. Not yet. The Catalina was overloaded by nearly 2 tons. Its climb rate was almost 0. Every gust of wind felt like a hand trying to push them back down into the ocean. "We're wallowing, Skipper," Ensign Pat Tatum said, voice tight. "If we lose an engine—" "We don't lose engines," Gordon cut in. "Keep her nose up." The instrument needles jittered from the turbulence. The altimeter barely ticked upward. 150 feet, 200, 250. That was all. If either Pratt & Whitney faltered, they'd stall and fall straight into the Bismarck Sea. Gordon eased back the throttles a fraction. Not too much. Just enough to stop the propellers from overspeeding. The Catalina steadied slightly. Below, the gray expanse of water rolled endlessly, flecked with white foam. To the north, the dark line of Kavieng receded behind them, a place now hidden by rain and fire. Through breaks in the clouds, flashes of muzzle fire glimmered like distant lightning. The Japanese gunners were still searching the storm for their target, unaware that the flying boat they'd tried to kill was already climbing into the clouds above them, carrying their former victims. "Status?" Gordon called over his shoulder. Chief Petty Officer Ralph DeBlanc crawled up from the waist compartment, face blackened with oil. "Bilge pumps are working, but we've got leaks along the keel," he shouted. "We'll have to keep her light or she'll swamp before we get home." "How light?" DeBlanc gave a half grin. "Light enough that maybe you throw me out first." It was gallows humor, the kind men used when they had nothing left to lose. Gordon allowed himself the faintest smile. "Not today, Chief." The Catalina pushed on through the storm, climbing slowly, engine temperatures creeping toward the red. Fuel burn was enormous. They'd been airborne less than 20 minutes and already used a quarter of their reserve. Gordon did the math silently. At this rate, they'd never reach Dobodora or Samurai, their nearest friendly bases, but turning back was unthinkable. At 12:15 hours, the first survivor stirred, a bombardier named Harold Wilson, his head bandaged, eyes unfocused. Where are we?" he rasped. "Alive," Gordon said simply. He blinked, trying to understand. "You came for us?" Gordon kept his eyes on the horizon. Somebody had to. The storm didn't ease. In fact, it worsened. Sheets of rain swept across the cockpit, hammering the plexiglass canopy like gravel. Lightning crackled above the wings. Every few seconds, the altimeter needle dropped 20 feet, then bounced back. The crew had stopped talking. Even the rescued airmen sat silently now, listening to the groaning metal around them. The Catalina was never built for speed or grace. It was built for endurance, for stubbornness. And right now, stubbornness was all that kept them in the air. As they crossed the first 100 miles south of Kavieng, the radio came alive with bursts of static. Thomas Rhodes, the radio man, fiddled with the dials, trying to punch through the interference. HQ, this is Catalina Black Cat 35, reporting rescue of downed B-17 crew, 15 survivors aboard, returning south. Request weather and position fix. Only static replied. Then a faint voice crackled back. Dobador Control, we copy. You're deep in a cyclone cell. Head due south-southeast. Winds 40 knots. God help you. Rhodes turned to Gordon. They said cyclone. Gordon didn't answer. The word hung in the air like a curse. Overloaded, low on fuel, leaking, and now flying into the heart of a tropical cyclone. The Catalina's wings shook so violently that rivets popped like gunfire. The compass spun erratically. The horizon vanished completely. They flew blind in a gray tunnel of rain. Tatum glanced at the gauges, then at Gordon. She can't take this much longer. She'll take it as long as we need her to, Gordon said. His knuckles were white on the yoke. Minutes stretched into hours. The ocean below rose and fell like a living thing, heaving under the storm's breath. Gordon found himself talking quietly to the plane. Easy, girl, just a little farther. At 4:10 hours, the warning light flickered, left engine oil pressure dropping. DeBlanc was already moving, crawling through the narrow fuselage to check lines and pumps. Oil cooler's half blocked with salt spray, he yelled. I can bypass it, but she'll run hot. Do it, Gordon said. We've got no choice. The temperature gauge climbed into the red. The smell of burning oil filled the cockpit. The left engine sputtered, coughed, and steadied again. Rhodes finally broke through the radio static. Samurai Air Station acknowledges sending beacon pulse. They're clearing a landing area. How far? Gordon asked. 200 miles. 200 miles. At their current speed, a pathetic 100 knots, it might as well have been the moon. The survivors were slipping into shock again. The med kit was nearly empty. DeBlanc had given the last of the morphine to the B-17's navigator, whose leg was shattered. Gordon ordered the crew to wrap the men in parachutes for warmth. The Catalina's cabin reeked of salt water and gasoline. Then, just as hope began to fade, the clouds ahead lightened. Patches of blue broke through the storm. Rhodes checked the compass, then looked out the window. We're through! We're through the cell! The sea below had calmed slightly, though heavy swells still rolled east to west. Through the haze, faint outlines of land appeared. The south tip of New Guinea. Home was close now, maybe another hour's flight. Gordon let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Hold together, he murmured to the Catalina. Just hold together. But the ocean had one last test. At 15:30 hours, as they neared the coast, another squall rose behind them, black clouds rolling over the horizon, closing fast. The sun was setting, turning the storm into a wall of molten gray. Rhodes tried to raise the base again, but got nothing. Static swallowed his words. We're out of fuel, Tatum warned. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Gordon nodded. Then we'll make those 10 minutes count. He trimmed the plane for descent, scanning the waves below. They were still too rough for a safe water landing, but smoother than anything near Kavieng had been. The coastline was somewhere ahead, hidden in rain. Tatum leaned closer. You think we'll make land? Gordon's eyes stayed on the instruments. We'll make something. The Catalina descended slowly, engines laboring, wings trembling under the weight of salt and exhaustion. The men inside were silent. The ocean waited below, its surface dark and glassy now, like a mirror that could break at any moment. For the second time that day, Gordon would have to gamble his life, and everyone else's, on a landing the book said was impossible. And as the Catalina began its slow, desperate glide toward the waves, the world outside turned to silver. Sky and sea blending into one, as if daring him to find the line between life and death. One more time.
The Catalina dropped through the clouds like a wounded bird, its engines coughing and wheezing, the horizon vanishing in sheets of silver rain. Lieutenant Nathan Gordon could barely see the sea below, just a shifting blur of gray and white. His altimeter read 300 feet, fuel gauges trembled on empty. Behind him, 15 men waited in silence, soaked and shivering, watching rivulets of water crawl down the fuselage walls. The aircraft felt impossibly heavy now, sagging under the weight of exhaustion and humanity. "We've got to put her down, Skipper," Ensign Pat Tatum said quietly. Gordon nodded once. "We'll try to make Samurai. If we can't, we make it here." The radio sputtered again, Rhodes trying to raise the bass. Only static. The electric whine of overworked generators filled the cockpit. "We've lost beacon signal. They can't hear us." "And they'll see us," Gordon said, adjusting the flaps. He banked the Catalina southward. Through a thin break in the rain, the crew glimpsed the dark shape of a coastline, New Guinea. They were close, closer than they had any right to be. But the weather was closing again, a final wall of storm curling over the ocean like a living thing determined to pull them back. "5 minutes of fuel left," DeBlanc called from the waist compartment. "After that, we're swimming." Gordon's hands gripped the controls so hard his knuckles turned white. "Gear up, flaps 30. Ready to ditch if we have to." The Catalina descended into the storm, wind tearing at its wings. The engines screamed in protest. Rain pelted the cockpit so hard it sounded like machine gun fire. The altimeter spun. 100 feet. 50. 20. "Now!" Gordon shouted. He pulled the nose up slightly, leveled the wings, and braced. The hull slammed into the ocean with a violence that defied imagination. The impact threw men from their seats, ripped gear loose from the walls. Water blasted through the seams, drenching everything. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled with a long, groaning skid. Gordon's forehead hit the control yoke. He blinked, tasted blood, and looked up. The engines were still turning, coughing weakly. They were down, alive. "All right," he gasped. "Pump her dry. Keep her afloat." The waves rocked the Catalina like a cradle of chaos. Outside, the sea hissed and foamed, but it was calmer than before, calm enough to survive. The men inside were silent for a long time, their faces lit by the dim red glow of the emergency lights. One of the rescued B-17 crewmen whispered, "We're still alive?" "You are," Gordon said softly. "All of you." Tatum laughed once, a sharp, broken sound that turned into a sob. "You mad son of a gun, you actually did it!" "Not yet," Gordon replied. "We still have to make it home." They taxied slowly toward the faint outline of the coast, the hull grinding against the swells. The engines sputtered out one by one until silence remained. Just wind, rain, and the creak of metal. They drifted for an hour before the storm began to die. When the clouds finally broke, the world was washed in pale gold. The sun dipped low, turning the ocean into a sheet of liquid light. Ahead lay the green shadow of New Guinea, the mountains rising like sentinels. "There," Rhodes said, pointing. "That's Samurai Island. We made it." The Catalina glided toward the sheltered inlet, waves softening as they passed the reef. Fishermen on the shore dropped their nets and stared as the great silver flying boat limped in from the horizon, bullet-scarred and half-sunk. Gordon guided her toward the shallows, the keel scraping sand as the aircraft settled. The water was waist-deep when the crew opened the hatch. Fresh air flooded in, cool and sharp. Gordon climbed down first, helping each man out one by one. The rescued airmen stumbled onto the beach, some weeping, some laughing, all of them too weak to stand for long. On the sand, Gordon finally let go of the yoke still clutched in his mind. His arms trembled uncontrollably. He looked back at the Catalina. The plane floated low, her nose dented, paint scorched, but still whole. She had carried them farther than reason allowed. DeBlanc waded up beside him, coughing seawater. 15 souls, Skipper," he said voice hoarse. "Every damn one." Gordon stared at the horizon, the gray wall of the retreating storm, the ocean that had tried to kill them and failed. He said quietly, "Make that 16. They built fires that night along the beach to signal the search planes. By dawn, rescue boats arrived from Samurai.
When the medics came on board, they counted every man, no fatalities, no missing. Against every law of physics and probability, Nathan Gordon and his crew had brought everyone back. As he sat on the sand, wrapped in a blanket, Gordon heard one of the medics whisper, "Nobody lands in that sea. Nobody survives that storm." Gordon didn't answer. He was staring at the Catalina, her wings catching the morning light like the arms of something ancient and defiant. "She did," he said quietly. "We did." And as the tide crept in, washing over the sand, the last traces of the storm faded away, leaving only the sound of waves, the murmur of men alive against all odds, and the shape of a flying boat resting where sky and sea had finally agreed to let her rest.
The official report written the next morning at Samurai Air Station was clinical, stripped of everything that made the day miraculous. It read, Lieutenant J.G. Nathan Green Gordon, USN, Patrol Squadron 34, rescued 15 crew members of a downed B-17 under heavy enemy fire and severe weather conditions, landing and taking off 3 times in hostile waters north of Cavite. There was no mention of the 30-foot swells, the smell of burned oil, or the way the Catalina screamed when its hull hit the sea. The report couldn't capture what it felt like to stand in a storm and choose to land anyway, but the men who lived it never forgot. For days, the story spread quietly through the Pacific bases, from Dobadura to Port Moresby, from carrier decks to jungle airstrips. Pilots read it aloud in mess tents like a myth retold around a campfire. "He landed a flying boat in a hurricane," they'd say, "under fire 3 times." The words were always followed by silence, then disbelief, then a kind of reverence. Back in New Guinea, Gordon's crew returned to patrol duty as if nothing had happened. The Catalina had been patched with new aluminum panels and carried on her nose a small piece of hand-painted lettering, Arkansas Traveler. The name was Gordon's idea, a nod to his home state and to the plane that had traveled farther than any reasonable machine ever should. Months later, word came down through command channels that Gordon was being recommended for the Medal of Honor, the first ever awarded to a Navy patrol plane pilot in the Pacific. His men didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. They'd seen the medal's worth out on the sea. On October 8, 1944, in a quiet ceremony at the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Gordon in his dress whites. The room was filled with admirals, correspondents, and photographers, but for Gordon, it might as well have been the cockpit of his Catalina again, the hum of engines still in his ears, the faces of the rescued still fresh in his mind. Roosevelt smiled as he pinned the blue ribbon around his neck. "Lieutenant Gordon, few men have ever fought both nature and the enemy in the same hour and won against both." Gordon simply nodded. "Thank you, sir." After the war, he went home to Morrilton, Arkansas, where parades lined the streets and church bells rang for their returning hero. He rarely spoke about the rescue. When people asked, he'd say, "I just did my job." He became a lawyer, then a judge, and later the governor of Arkansas. But in every office he ever held, there was always a small framed photograph on his desk, the Catalina on the beach at Samurai, her hull battered, her wings drooping, and a line of exhausted men standing beside her. The citation for his Medal of Honor described conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But for Gordon, it was never about duty. It was about choice. A decision made in the heart of a storm, when orders said wait and conscience said go. His crew received the Navy crosses they deserved. Pat Tatum, Ralph DeBlanc, and Thomas Rhodes all returned home alive. DeBlanc would later tell a reporter, "That day, the ocean was the enemy. The plane, the storm, they all wanted to kill us. But Nate just wouldn't let them." The PBY Catalina, that ungainly flying boat once considered obsolete, went on to serve in every ocean of the war, from the Atlantic's U-boat hunts to the blacked-out night raids of the Black Cats. But among thousands of missions, none became legend quite like Gordon's. His flight proved that courage wasn't about speed or power, it was about defiance, about taking a machine meant for endurance and turning it into salvation. In the decades that followed, the Navy changed. Jets replaced propellers, satellites replaced radio beacons. But in every training manual,
Under the section titled Sea Landings in Heavy Weather, one example remained etched in ink. VP 34, Lieutenant J.G. Nathan G. Gordon, February 16, 1943. In 1975, at the dedication of the Arkansas Air Museum, Gordon stood beside a restored PBY 5A, not his, but one that bore the same markings. He was older now, slower, his hair gone gray. A reporter asked him what he remembered most. Gordon looked up at the wings, still gleaming in the sunlight, and said, "The noise, the way the wind howled, and the faces when we finally lifted off. That's when I knew it wasn't luck. It was something else." He tapped the aluminum skin of the plane, his hand trembling slightly. "You don't win against the sea," he said softly. "You just ask it for mercy and hope it listens." The crowd was silent. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of engines echoed. An airshow flyover, 3 vintage planes cutting across the sky. Gordon smiled faintly. "There she is," he said, almost to himself. The traveler. When he passed away in 2008, age 92, his Medal of Honor rested atop his coffin, polished and blue, the same color of the sea he'd once defied. Today, in the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, his photograph still hangs beside a section of PBY hull marked with salt stains and bullet holes. The plaque beneath it reads, "In memory of Lieutenant Nathan Green Gordon, USN, who landed in a hurricane under enemy fire to save 15 men, February 16, 1943, so that others might live." Outside, the Florida sky is bright and cloudless, but if you stand long enough in that quiet hall, you can almost hear it, the distant roar of waves, the thunder of engines, and the heartbeat of a flying boat lifting from the storm, carrying 15 souls toward the fragile, luminous edge of dawn.